the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, the 13th of October, 2024. As always, I'm talking to you from San Francisco. Rather unlucky today because the Blue Angels are in the sky. So if you hear a lot of jets in the background, World War III has not broken out. Earlier this week, we did a great show with Tavis Smiley, one of Black America's best-known broadcasters, radio journalists. He's the author of The Covenant with Black America 20 years later. It's the third edition of the book. And at the end of our conversation, I asked Tavis Smiley about reparations for Black America. This is what he said.
Absolutely. I still think that we have to define what we mean when we use that term. Again, these words have so many, they're so amorphous in some ways. We need a universal, I think, definition of reparations. We don't have a universal definition of that.
A universal declaration of reparations. I'm not sure if one exists, but our guest today, Joel Edward Goza, has a new book out. He's an authority on reparations. The book is called Rebirth of a Nation, Reparations and Remaking America. Joel teaches in Louisville, Kentucky, where he is talking to us from. Joel, do you agree with Tavis? Do we need, when we're talking about reparations, a definition of what this word means?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think that a definition is absolutely crucial for what that word means. But as you know, many terms out in the public, it will mean different things to different people. And part of the process of working through reparations is really a defining of what people mean. And there have been a number of different definitions historically that people have leaned in. Some people, when they speak on reparations, will emphasize cash payments. Some people will emphasize more holistic investments into Black communities and into Black America. But I think that working for a more standard definition will help improve the aims of those who are working for reparations.
This is your second book. Your first was called America's Unholy Ghosts, The Racist Roots of Our Faith and Politics. For people who are listening rather than watching, you're a white American. What is it about this subject, Joel, that has triggered your academic interest? It's something that you obviously care a great deal about. I mean, I'm not suggesting, of course, that only Black Americans should be interested in reparations, particularly for racism and slavery. But tell me a little bit about your life and your introduction, if you like, to this subject.
Sure. Well, for me, it didn't start off as an academic exercise. One of the things that happened to me when I was in my 20s is I was in a time of life where I was really struggling, having a hard time. And I had a friend teaching down in Houston's 5th Ward. And so during that time, he invited my friends and I to join him down in the community. And so we moved in. And it became an introduction to a community that I never really knew much about. And what ended up happening is really for the last 20 years or so, I've been living in minority communities and working for Black organizations for most of that time. So when it comes to the work of reparations, over the last 20 years, I've had to do the work of a lot of unlearning of the things that I thought I knew about our nation, the things that I thought I knew about racial justice, and really beginning from the bottom up of understanding how it is that our nation has gotten to a point whereas the Kerner commissions would say that we became two different nations, separate and unequal.
So let's, before we get to Rebirth of a Nation and your thinking on the current challenge and need for reparations, tell me a little bit about your childhood. You said you came to this subject in your 20s. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in the suburbs of Houston, Texas, and I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household. And, you know, it was a community that loved me and that really deeply invested in me and grew up in very much a religious context. But despite the love that was poured into me, one of the things that I realized later on is that a segregated community is not designed to create self-awareness. It's not designed to create social depth perception. And so one of the things that I would say, you know, when I'm speaking on this, when I'm writing on this, is much that I thought that I knew about Black America, I had really learned from Ronald Reagan. And then once life kind of flipped on its head for me, I had to begin questioning much of what I was raised to believe.
Yeah, we're going to come to Reagan later, but tell me a little bit more about your evangelical origins. You wrote
Sure.
an interesting, co-authored an interesting piece in 2020 on evangelical Christians, evangelical Christians were once saved. After Trump, they're lost. Did you grow up in a kind of hardcore white evangelical family?
Yeah, you know, when we were growing up, our preachers would self-identify as fundamentalists, which is a little bit to the right of where evangelicals are. And yet my parents really encouraged me to pursue education. I went to an evangelical college called Wheaton College that evangelicals at least considered kind of the Harvard of the evangelical world. Went off to seminary, studied at Duke University, and really for much of my life, what my aim was, what my goal was to become a Southern Baptist preacher out in the suburbs. Now, obviously, it didn't end up working that way, but religion, Christianity was very central to my faith and to my identity, and it still very much is central to my faith and identity. But what ended up happening, I spoke about moving into the Fifth Ward and having lived there for almost 20 years, is that I was really taken under the wings of a Black church in the community. And the church spearheaded a lot of the urban redevelopment work there in the area. And I was provided an opportunity to really begin learning about the potential of American democracy, American Christianity through the perspective of the Black church tradition. And so that really provided a pivot in my thinking. And it was really through that lens that I work and I write.
Was it really a pivot though, Joel? Some people might think, perhaps skeptically, that he was a guy brought up with all the idealism, the blinkers, the discrimination, and the idealism of white evangelical Christianity. And then he discovered the Black church and just went over to the other side where the principles, the idealism, and perhaps the lack of realism aren't entirely different.
Sure. Well, what was very fundamentally different is the lens through which Jesus himself and his ministry was really understood. And so within the Black church context, the reality of Jesus being poor, being marginalized, being of Israel, which was an enslaved people, that was deeply emphasized. And the political visions and the political understandings of that took on a very central meanings in ways that they didn't in the church that I grew up with. And so when you look at the origins of the Black church, the origins of the Black church really emerged after slavery. They come out of hiding in some instances, and they become the incubator for religious care, for political leadership, for education. And so it was a vision that was much more deeply holistic than the one that I grew up in, where it was more of an emphasis on just Jesus saving your soul, your relationship to Jesus, without necessarily reading the centrality of when Jesus talks about in Matthew 25, when you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me, and the type of different measurements for what things look like. So very specifically, within the Black church, you measure your society by how it takes care of the least of these. That wasn't a logic that I was raised under.
Let's get Joel to the book. Fascinating title, Rebirth of a Nation. So many interpreters over the last 300 years of American history have seen race as absolutely central. And of course, the history of slavery, the Civil War, and then Jim Crow. Is that your reading of American history? Is slavery and racism, are they essential? Are they the fundamental truth to the narrative of the American Republic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is where the battleground of what democracy looks like has historically taken place. Obviously, it's at the very forefront of our founding fathers' thoughts when they go.
Well, not obviously. I mean, when you read the Federalist Papers, for example, when you read Madison or Hamilton, there's not a lot of stuff about race.
Well, what ends up happening is that there's a very particular perspective taken within the Federalist Papers in a way of harmonizing. And so when you look at what is going on within these writings, particularly if you talk about a Madison, you never can separate the political from the biographical, right? And so growing up in Virginia, as a lot of the founders did, whether it's George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison is hugely central. Slavery is at the heartbeat of society. You know, at the very heartbeat, and those type of instincts of figuring out a way to design a republic that can harmonize with these instincts is absolutely critical for the birth of America. When you look at what the founders are writing, you know, under the Constitutional Convention, it's clear that becomes the critical issue that they are wrestling with in many ways, and as far as trying to seek how to harmonize the interests of the South and the North. So to put it at ever a kind of secondary sideline issue is just disingenuous to what American history is.
What drove this then? I mean, there are two core interpretations. You know, obviously a lot more about this than me. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, an intrinsic biological racism, and on the other hand, a new kind of capitalism. We've had people on the show suggesting that the roots, the essence of American capitalism lies in the slave-based system. What's your interpretation, Joe?
Well, when you look at the rise of America and the political ideas that give rise to America, a number of the most influential founders had already invested in slavery. And and I'm thinking of people like a Thomas Hobbes, a John Locke, people of this guild. And so
when you say Locke and Hobbes, what do you mean invested in slavery?
They own stock in slave trading companies. So they deeply invested their wealth to make sure that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about Locke and Hobbes's portfolio of investments, but I hadn't heard that before. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes one of the things that becomes important, you know, when we're reading history and when we're thinking about these thinkers, is to think about what their biography is, because that helps us understand the very nature of the work that they're doing. If the question is, could capitalism have existed without slavery, I wouldn't know how to answer that. But that they emerge in the same era is a historical reality.
But isn't that the core? And again, you need to correct me if I'm wrong, on the reparations argument, or one of the arguments, is that because American capitalism was so deeply, and I use this word carefully, obviously a pun here, indebted to the slave system, that any kind of wealth in America, or even for people who arrived in the country after the end of slavery, or even after the end of Jim Crow, they have there's a benefit from the legacy, not just of slavery, but of racism.
Right. Well, what those who are arguing for reparations are saying is that there is a national responsibility here. And when, for instance, Frederick Douglass is doing the work that he is doing, he says, you know, the Civil War wasn't something that I wanted. I tried to cry out to the nation's conscience, but there wasn't a conscience to cry out to. because the nation had embraced slavery. And in doing so, they'd crucified their conscience, and that it received blessings at every level to be able to harmonize with the monstrous work of slavery. There's a notion that I use called white consensus. And the idea is that, when you have the Constitutional Convention, you have some people who are deeply against slavery. And yet slavery becomes a monster that they are ready to do business with. Following Reconstruction, not everybody in the nation wants Jim Crow, but Jim Crow becomes something that we are ready to do business with. And so if we are not actively perpetuating, then the nation becomes, at least in the minimal, complicit. And that
what does that mean, the nation becomes complicit? Are you suggesting that, Frederick Douglass, of course, was a 19th century figure. Are you suggesting that someone who arrives in this country from, I don't know, Hong Kong or Vietnam or Laos, that they are somehow complicit in this system if they arrived in America of the 1970s or 80s?
What the argument, particularly for people who have immigrated, 1970s, 1980s, is that they are immigrating into a nation with a deep debt. And if this is the nation that they partner with, then they take on the responsibility of the nation's history and of trying to deal with that history. But one of the things I try to make clear in Rebirth of the Nation is that we're not simply dealing with wounds from a distant past. We're dealing with the wounds of the type of racial inequalities that we have today. And so the crimes that slavery began never came to an end in this nation. And I think immigration is just one of the most wonderful blessings that this nation has ever experienced. I've lived many years within immigrant communities. And this nation is many things, but we cannot offer immigrants a nation without a history.
Joe, how would you respond there? We've done some shows actually on the Vietnamese community on the coastline of Texas. Very interesting community, very interesting history. How would you respond to a Vietnamese immigrant who would say, well, what about what the Americans owe me for the invasion of Vietnam and the destruction of my country and my people? At what point does this argument become slightly absurd?
I think that's a good question. As far as how is it that you navigate some of the various issues? However, I think what is morally absurd is this notion that you can keep on committing crimes and never have to do right by people who you committed the crimes against. So, for instance, Japanese Americans did pursue reparations for the crimes committed, and they were provided. Different nations have pursued reparations from America in the era of lynching, and they were provided. And so the argument of absurdity has often arose when we have spoken of the repeated abuses of African Americans and the refusal to ever really address that in a meaningful way that empowers racial and economic equity.
Joe, and you've heard these arguments, but they still need to be made.
Sure.
It seems to me, again, as someone who has great interest in American history, I'm not a professional American historian like you, that perhaps the greatest crime of all, beyond slavery, was the genocide of North America's native peoples. There are barely any native peoples left to claim reparations. How does that enter into this narrative?
Well, and I think that on some of those issues, it becomes somewhat instructive. One is that reparations have been paid to some extent for Native Americans, certainly not fully. But what the
argument mildly, Joe.
No. But hundreds of millions of dollars, billions have been provided in reparations for Native Americans. And I'm not saying at all, I'm not suggesting in any ways that we have done justly with Native Americans. But what I am suggesting is that if we want to create if we desire to pursue a nation that is interracial and pursues economic equity, then reparations become the path for that pursuit. So the question is not whether or not I think part of the wrestling with reparations is whether or not people desire a economically equitable nation. If we desire a nation with racial justice, and if the answers to that is yes, then I think that reparations provides a path to that. And if the answer to that is no, then there's nothing that you can say. But what ends up happening with us as a nation is that if we continue to commit crimes and we never take responsibility for those crimes, then we put ourselves in a position where we begin losing pieces of our humanity. And I think that's a very dangerous path to go on.
Yeah, I have to admit, I don't really understand what it means as a nation to lose a sense of your humanity. But let's get into the concrete details, because reparations is all about that. We have a reparations debate actually in California. I'm sure you're following it closely. And Tavis Smiley is rather disappointed. Let me show you this clip on Tavis's take on the reparations issue in California, the one that Gavin Newsom is responsible for, or perhaps not responsible for.
The whole nation is watching California to see what we're going to do on the issue of reparations. I can tell you this: I've been very, very, very disappointed in Gavin Newsom on this particular issue. He had an opportunity to do something here in this last session of the California legislature, and he, I think in many ways, punted the ball. One could even argue that Black people were exploited by the Gavin Newsom administration on this particular issue. So right now, I'm very disappointed on what we have done or not done, as it were, when we had the opportunity to do something here in California.
Joel, I don't want to turn this into a referendum on Gavin Newsom. Gets a lot of grief from everybody, it seems, these days. But I'm guessing you've been following the reparations issue in California. What do you make of it? Does it represent the beginning, at least, of a serious debate about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways that when it comes to reparations, California is the Alabama of Mississippi. What Alabama and Mississippi were during the Civil Rights era is what California is for reparations today. It's the testing ground. It's the proving ground of where that's of this work. And again, like you, I don't have any interest in turning Governor Newsom into any type of pinata, but I think that it does really embody the challenge that is facing the reparations movement, and that is the need for solidarity from white progressives. One of the things that becomes clear for King, clear for Malcolm X and others, is that one of the greatest barriers to racial justice in our nation hasn't simply been Southern segregationist, but it has been white moderates and white progressives who haven't fully stood in solidarity with the pursuit of Black justice.
Is there agreement, though, within the African American community? Lots of news this week, Joel, about the different attitudes of Black men and women to the Harris presidency, Obama, the vice presidency in the upcoming election. Obama was very critical and controversially critical about Black men. Are most African Americans on the same page on reparations?
Well, when it comes to the question of reparations, about 80% of African Americans support the idea of reparations and the need for reparations within America. At large, white America is about an inverse of that, where about 20% of white Americans support it and 80% are against it. So Black America has never been, never will be a monolith on all political issues, but there is overwhelming support for the need for reparations in America from Black Americans.
What about the other America? A couple of weeks ago, I did a show with Arlie Hochschild, a wonderful American sociologist, writer. Her new book, Stolen Pride, Lost Shame and the Rise of the Right, actually takes place in your backyard in Kentucky. I'm sure you're familiar with her work and her argument. The radical right in America, as Arlie makes clear, is already full of loss and shame about America. If this reparations issue is actually pursued seriously in a national sense, isn't that inevitably going to inflame the right? I mean, the 40 or 50% of Americans who are supportive of Trump.
Well, I think one of the wonderful things with the work of reparations is that there is a need to foster a real self-understanding in America about what our history is, about what our identity is. And what separates reparations from kind of a progressive form of self-hate when we look at our history is that we believe that there's another way forward, and that where we are today, we can really look at our history, look at the crimes we've committed, and choose a different path forward. As far as whether or not this will increase our divisions, we're already a divided nation. The question becomes is that if we are to craft a future that is more worthy of our children, we simply cannot do that without understanding the history that has created the realities that we're facing today.
You're just entering the culture wars. I could find many people who could come on the show and argue strongly against it, that they would suggest that what is past, and that the country doesn't have a moral responsibility, and that most Americans have shown up, most American families, after the institution of slavery. So aren't you just putting your foot, for better or worse? I mean, I appreciate your commitment on this issue, but aren't you just entering the culture wars? Aren't you just throwing another grenade into that by suggesting that people simply have to accept the argument even if they're not willing to?
Well, I mean, one of the things with history is, you can deny our history, you can bury it, but it can't be unlived, And so when I look at the work of reparations, the roots of this for me hasn't been, the white guilt of looking what happened 100 years ago, what happened 200 years ago. It is looking at the reality that we have today in cities across America and what these communities are facing. And what I had to learn is that the wounds that our communities bear, it didn't come out of just nothing. It came out of this deep history where this suffering was by design. And until we start correcting the designs of these things, then we can never hope to change some of the tragedies and the self-inflicted wounds that we have today. And I think in addition to that, one of the great things with the work of reparations is throughout our nation's history, we have had people saying that, if we bury this thing, we can just move on. If we bury this thing, we can just move on. But what the Black freedom movement has always been about, has it been about racial justice? Yes, but it is about tending to the wounds of our democracy. And we can wish to have ignored the past, but that is not going to make the past any less influential in what has shaped our wounds today.
Joel, you mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier. You had an interesting piece in The Hill from last year suggesting that California owes reparations for making Reagan president. I know Reagan also features in your book. What's Reagan's responsibility?
What Reagan ends up doing, his place in American history, is he is the person who is most successful in bringing an end to the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. He sells a very different vision that compounded America's racial crisis, that compounded America's economic inequalities. And when you look at a lot of the crises that are facing us today, whether that's economic inequality, whether that's the issue of mass incarceration, and a myriad of issues, public education, the turning point in American history is the election of Ronald Reagan. And that is what creates the context that will really become influential over American politics for the next 40 years. Until very recently, it was Reagan's show.
But Joel, there's another narrative that Reagan made America a vibrant economy. He's considered, at least by many historians, to be a great president. America now has the strongest economy in the world. How would you respond? Are you just suggesting these people are wrong? They don't get it?
Well, I think that when you look at what they say, the question for me is who has gotten to share in that economy? So after Reagan is president, was there some economic growth? Yes, there certainly is. But the spoils of that economic growth were not equally shared. That on average, people, even white males, are poor after Reagan than they were before. What he does is he creates a new class where becoming a millionaire or a billionaire is much, much more common after Reagan because of some of the policies that he made. But homelessness will go up about 400%. When we look at the distance between a minimum wage and a living wage, it's really under Reagan that this type of crisis where no longer does working provide for a family, that those things are engineered. And so a lot of the kind of praise of Reagan is for the creation of the millionaires and the billionaires, but it was not a creation of a stronger middle of America by any chance.
John, I wonder if your use of reparations is rather akin to Democrats and Republicans now in Congress, who every time they don't like a president try to impeach them. I mean, how could Reagan be bound up? You may not like his politics. He's a controversial figure. But what has Reagan got to do with reparations?
What Reagan has to
why
do
are
with
you even using this word? I don't know. It's the title of the Hill piece. I'm not sure if you discussed the idea of reparations when it came to Reagan.
Mm-hmm. Well, the idea is that Reagan is very central with the type of racial inequalities that we are facing today. I mean, he's
central?
a central player. From his war on drugs to his economic policies to his social policies, Reagan becomes Black America's worst nightmare. And Black America saw it coming. You know, you have Andrew Young, you have Coretta Scott King, you have James Baldwin, all trying to warn America about the dangers of a Reagan presidency. But America was not ready to listen in any way, shape, or fashion. And what ends up happening is that you create a world now where, do we have a strong economy? Yeah, we're the wealthiest nation in the world. And yet poverty is our fourth leading cause of death in this nation. And it is that creation of the mega rich.
Yeah, but you're not answering my question. I take your point. You don't like Reagan, which is a controversial position. What's it got to do with reparations?
The reason that it has to do with reparations is that it has shaped the economic realities that we're facing as a nation today.
But isn't there an argument against reparations that, in a way, your reading at least, which is, I certainly don't share it, is that somehow Reagan, deepened all the structural problems in America without doing anything good. But Reagan, of course, existed in the, he grew up in the Midwest. He spent most of his life in California. He didn't come from the South. He had no experience of slavery. Are you suggesting that he was driven by some sort of white racist fantasy? I know you've written extensively on white America's racist fantasy. Was Reagan guilty of this too?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, when you start looking at the way that he pursues power with the character of a welfare queen, when you look at him supporting every segregationist senator, when you look at him denying all the civil rights legislation, when you look at all of his public policies, there's a very consistent theme. Now, what Reagan is different than the Southern segregationist is that he wraps it in a very different and more appealing packaging for both the North and the South. But I mean, it is no coincidence that he starts his campaigning off in Philadelphia, Mississippi. It's no coincidence that he says that if there is a Southern strategy, that I'm a part of it. There's no coincidence that he says that what we need now is more states' rights. And, to think that Reagan was anything less than a racist, what that shows us is how influential his thinking on race has really shaped us. Because what Reagan was able to do is to divorce our thinking of race from the issues of public policies and racial impact to simply and merely personal relationships. And so what Reagan would do is he would get mad. He'd say, I can't be racist. I have Black friends. And yet, when you look at what the policies that he pursued, particularly in the war on drugs and the targeting of those issues, I mean, it creates a racial disaster that America read as being just happenstance. But if you look at Reagan's career, of his raising through the Red Scare, of his training at General Electric, there is a consistent through line on all of these issues. So yeah, I mean, I think that he is the most influential figure on economic inequality and on racial injustice since really since the 1920s.
Interesting. Some people might suggest that was Richard Nixon, but that's another question. A couple more quick questions on the reparations issue. There was a headline in the Daily Beast about King Charles of England now, the King Charles III of England, facing a $240 billion slavery reparations bill. Should foreign countries like Britain, which of course were the original colonialists in North America, and I guess in a sense responsible for slavery, should they be paying this reparations too? Are they all responsible?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not as familiar with the situation in England, but obviously England has a huge debt to pay in the creation of colonialism, in their support of slavery. We have to remember that both in America and England, they paid reparations to enslavers. So it's not a new idea. I mean, what the advocates are saying is that if you can imagine paying reparations to enslavers, which happens both in America and in England, it is not too early to begin thinking about reparations for the descendants of the enslaved.
Let's end concretely. There's an interesting piece in the Washington Post recently about if there is indeed, and I'm sure you're a Harris supporter, I certainly am, that if she wins the election in November, it will boost momentum on reparations to Black Americans. If indeed Harris is elected, what would you like her to do on the reparations front? What is realistic, manageable, given the limitations and challenges of American politics in the 2020s?
Sure. Well, I think what she'll have a position to do and have a profound impact on is creating a context for these type of conversations to be more central. And so what I would like to see from a potential Harris presidency is something very much more like the Kerner Commission. For a long time on HR 40, advocates for reparations have been hoping that Congress would pass a research study on the work of reparations. But Harris will be in position to do that as a president. She can. And I think what becomes really important in this time is that she receives the support from white progressive folks to really pursue that work, the support from a Gavin Newsom, the support from a Josh Shapiro, the support from various governors throughout America. But she can drastically improve the context for the conversation on reparations to gain traction.
And are there models, Joel, from overseas that often people point to what happened in South Africa after the end of apartheid? Can we Americans learn from other countries on this?
Yeah, I think that there are things from other countries. I write extensively about Germany. I write a little bit about South Africa. But I think one of the things that we must learn from at this point in our nation is our own history. And so following the Civil War, for instance, Frederick Douglass is crying out for economic empowerment. He's crying out for deeper repentance within our nation, but the nation ignored him. And since the nation didn't do that work, it left fertile ground for the re-entrenchment of white supremacy that was bad for all Americans. After the fall of segregation, Martin Luther King Jr. was crying out for the nation to search its soul, to develop morally on racial issues. He was crying out for economic empowerment. And we refuse to do that. And by looking at our own history and how we have continually re-entrenched both racial injustice and economic inequality, we can learn from our own history that what we have done in the past, we cannot continue. And we are entering into a new racial age, that the colorblind rhetoric that I grew up with under Reagan no longer holds water. And so the question becomes is what type of work do we have to do now in order to craft the future that we desire?
Well, Joel, Edward Goza, the author, Rebirth of a Nation, controversial, but very interesting, particularly on Reagan. We'll have to do another show. Particularly, I hope if Trump is defeated, if he's president, then I think this opens up a new chapter in your themes. Congratulations, Joel, on the book. Keep doing the good work
Thank
and
you.
talking about this all-important subject in American history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.